I am not a reader. I have made 2 videos about books in my almost decade on YouTube. So when I got access to a brand new book by a new indie author, I couldn't say no. Now, before we get to the story, there are several maps that are displayed. If I had printer ink, I would show these maps on my actual set. This was an edition that really paints the Odalian Empire, the Kingdom of Sael, the Barony of Goran, and the Wastes. All of these which I could be mispronouncing, so I apologize if that's the case. Currently, these places don't mean much, but once I read these names again, it'll be nice to have a bit more of a reference point. It's kind of like when I would play D&D and my friend would make us a bunch of maps for us to traverse using Roll20, and also like a map maker. The story is about a steampunk society split into multiple tiers, both literally and symbolically. A caste system in a sense, where part 1 focuses on the lowest of the low, not having a place to live and scrounging for everything, even if that means participating in illegal affairs. Part 2 is one step up from there, the working class, the proletariats, if you will. Yet even though these people can make a wage, that doesn't always mean it's a living wage. Part 3 is high society, royalty and generals, while part 4 ties back into part 2. And past that, part 5 showcases all of our heroes. I would also like to mention that this will be a spoiler-free review, since I have chosen my words very carefully so as to not spoil the plot. So that way you can read the book for yourself, because you should, especially if you like to help support independent authors and independent art. There are 4 different versions of this book: Kindle edition, paperback, hardcover, and if you really want a special edition, which is what I was going to buy until I realized how broke I actually was, the author can book bind it by hand, and it looks so cool. And it's an edition I'm planning on getting at some point in the future, but there's a limited amount, so we'll see if that ever happens. At the very least, I am planning on buying a hardcover, but the only one I could afford was paperback. So we're going to talk about the paperback version. Although the version we're actually talking about is the art copy, the advanced reader copy for non-readers like myself. So this is talking about that version of the book because the author was so kind to send that version to me, which I greatly appreciate, so thank you for that. But I did buy the actual book too, so we'll have that on hand as well. Something I appreciate that I was not expecting is that in the copyright section, it is written that the cover is not made with AI, which is a disclaimer that I personally appreciate, and that the artists encourage the support of human art, which that is a disclaimer we should normalize. If something uses AI, please disclaim that it is AI. Alright, so the official release starts with a section called the Dreadnought, which is basically a prologue, which wasn't in the beta version. This prologue opens about an airship, which is already a better start than the beta version, honestly. It hooked me from the very beginning. So part 1 is the engineer. And just like the beginning of a D&D campaign, one of the characters starts off in a pub. A Goran standard newspaper is in this pub, which Goran was one of the places on the map. Originally, I wasn't sure what kind of angle I would take with this sort of review, but I think referencing these maps might help us visualize the story setting. Janna is a part of the Greyer Rebellion, whose termination made highlights in this very paper, since her father was Greyer, a freedom fighter in the conflict between the Odalian Empire and the Carlsbane. Janna and Greyer are on the side of the Carlsbane, but by the time the war ended, the rebellion still antagonized the Odalian Empire, which didn't sit well with Janna. Janna then moved to Goran, which, since it was under the control of the Odalian, she had to go undercover to cut ties with her father's name. Already, I love this dynamic between what the father did and the enemies her father made, which haunts the main character, making sense why she has jumped from job to job under an alias. This immediately creates both internal and external conflict with Janna, creating life-threatening stakes from the first few pages. A few pages later, we get a very vivid description of this whole society, which I'm going to read to you because I love exactly how it's put, and this passage will also show you how visual the storytelling is. It's like a movie is playing in your head. It's so good. The city of Goran was split into 3 tiers, built one on top of the other, towering into the air on massive struts of metal and stone. The topmost layer was referred to as the Crown. It was true to the gold and marble palaces and mansions which gracefully adorn the upper heights of the city. The second layer, far larger, was home to the inevitable middle class, Wow, very relatable. The houses there were clean, the jobs paid well, and weren't likely to break your back. And for the most part, the crime wasn't too bad. For the better part of 3 years, she, aka Jana, had been bumming around in rented rooms of pubs and bars on the lowest layer until she got behind enough on rent to be kicked out. That was the nature of life in the lowest tier of Goran, where there weren't sleazy bars and dives, there were horrible factories and workhouses which used the blood, sweat, and tears of workers to grease their gears. The part of the lowest tier that lay directly beneath the middle layer was known quite infamously as the Undercity. The Undercity lay in perpetual shadow beneath the upper platforms, festering in the dark and rarely spoken of without a curse. Though some innocents lived there in destitute, whether in slummy apartment houses or on the streets, most who ventured there were involved in some kind of crime or vice. And while that was a very long passage, that will be the only passage that I directly read, but I also thought that was the perfect way to describe how the city functions. Jana is then hired to steal an airship. This is where the title finally appears in the story. I forgot I also wrote this. This is also a quote that appears in the book. At the heart of resistance is a man mad enough to say no, and he will be the eye of the storm which will topple nations and grind tyrants to dust. This is a quote of some kind in the book, but it's a quote that the character is saying, so the character got the quote from somewhere. I don't know where, it's never really said. Oh yeah, and this mysterious man knows Jana's full name. This mysterious man's name is Arthur Pendington. In chapter 2, Paul and Maria are introduced here as a part of Arthur's crew once they get to their hideout. Maria speaks in sign language, and Paul interprets for her to the others around them. It's at this point where their differences as people start to clash. There's this banter between Jana and Arthur that is pretty humorous on occasion due to the nature of mocking each other with subtle callbacks and references, which is very entertaining, especially with their polar opposite backgrounds constantly causing strife. But also, at this point, they never want to see each other again after this job. Honestly, chapter 3 is just full of tension from various perspectives. By the next chapter, I realized that the imagery is very detailed and descriptive. I can very clearly imagine what the skydecks in Goran look like. I also was not expecting slapstick comedy, but I found it to be very hilarious. By chapter 4, I realized that part 1 is the gang trying to pull a heist. And although I haven't read a lot at this point in the story, chapter 4 is my favorite of part 1. You could really feel the incredible tension of the heist. After this point, I noticed that so far, each chapter is about 10 pages long, which makes reading a chapter a day to be pretty manageable. Except I still have 31 chapters to read, and the book officially releases in 23 days. Uh-oh. This now means that I have to read 2 chapters a day, at the very least. I mean, technically 1.3 chapters, but I'm not going to read 1.3 chapters. It doesn't make sense to only read less than half of a chapter. So we are going to round it up to 2 chapters a day, which I did. For the most part. Since there are 5 parts to this story, part 1 has very prevalent rising action that falls at the end of the 4th chapter. I was honestly expecting rising action until the conclusion, but I prefer the author's way instead because it keeps the story engaging since conflict keeps emerging at every corner. In part 1, it's alluded to that Jana has this vice that by the end of part 1, she literally tosses it over her shoulder due to unfortunate circumstances. The end of part 1 also gives more backstory as to Arthur's demeanor. So remember when I said the rising action falls at chapter 4? Well, it comes back in chapter 6 in an unexpected turn of events. Part 2, the Orphan. Elsie is introduced here, which is interesting because I thought for sure we were going to continue Jana's story since it seems like Jana was the main character, especially because of the name of part 2. But no, part 2 actually refers to Elsie, who is arguably the actual main character. And if that's the case, I guess technically part 1 was to introduce Arthur and the crew, or is Arthur the main character? I feel like this book has a lot of main characters. Anyways, part 2, the title of part 2 refers to Elsie, which speaking of that, now we have 2 orphans in the story, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Elsie worked by uniform making in the division of Odal in a warehouse. Overall, Elsie's working conditions are not great. But what do you expect when you hire children to work in a factory? Wow, that sounds ethical. In chapter 8, the story gets even darker, kind of out of nowhere, which I was not expecting. It's implied that some of the girls are not only born at the warehouse, but stay here their entire lives. Wow. Anyways, I kind of love the juxtapositions between part 1 and part 2. Part 1 was outside, while part 2 was, for the most part, in a confined space. In chapter 9, it really gripped my attention, and I could not stop reading due to the rising action. Probably my favorite chapter so far. At first, I wasn't sure about Elsie's introduction, but now I love how it was executed. And part 2 is just really engaging. I've gotten to the point in this story where I just don't want to stop reading. Like, it's really got its hooks into me. When we get to chapter 11, suffice to say, there's definitely some rising action here, but it gets resolved by the next chapter. There was a moment that I was expecting to happen, though I thought it was going to happen sooner, but not in the way that it actually happened. We then get an inside look as to how one of the characters thinks, which was a nice change of pace, especially because this character, I believe, was Maria. So to see her and hear her internal dialogue was pretty interesting. By the next chapter, I realized that this is a very found family type of book. And like I mentioned earlier, I also noticed that this book technically has a few main characters. Part 1 has a main character. Part 2 arguably has 2 main characters. And then part 3 has a main character. But we'll get to part 3 in a minute. Part 2 just made me miss Jana, honestly. I wanted more of Jana. She's great. I specifically missed the Jana-Arthur conflict. I thought it was hilarious. And by hilarious, I just meant their banter back and forth was hilarious, not the fact that, you know, war and violence and stuff. Part 3, the princess. So in part 1, the main perspective was from Jana. In part 2, it was from Elise, for the most part. In part 3, will we return back to Jana, follow an already established character, or introduce a completely new character? Vote now in the comments. If you remember what I said literally a minute ago, you already know the answer. The answer is Princess Yavanna, or Vanna. There's a line later where somebody mispronounces her name, which makes me realize I've been mispronouncing her name this entire time. I'm not sure. But Yavanna, Vanna, Princess Vanna. Is the Y silent? What is English? In chapter 16, we are now in Aldea. When I was first reading this, a perspective that I was not expecting was who was at the very top of this society. I'm not gonna lie, this chapter has a lot of names to keep track of, since a group of generals end up arguing over each other, but hey, we have the glossary that we're gonna get to later. So, if you get lost in this chapter, probably reference the glossary. That might help you a little bit. I didn't, because I forgot it was a thing. Jakik is introduced here. Jakik? Names are hard. I'm gonna call him Jakik because that's how I read him in my head when I was reading this book, which I assume is Yavanna's bodyguard of sorts. At least, that is how he acts. Enya is also introduced here, but she's a maidservant. I might mention this later, but these two side characters are great. Love these characters as a duo, specifically with their banter. They're pretty funny. I'm noticing a trend with each part now. A person lives in a society, but then escapes it for various plot reasons. By chapter 20, page 202 made me laugh at the beginning. I don't remember what it was because I didn't write the quote, but there's that. Now, part 1 ties into part 3 with mention of the crew from part 1. Now, this note is more of a personal preference, but I'm not gonna lie, part 3 is probably my least favorite part, except for Jakik and Enya. Mostly because there really aren't any stakes, only just a bunch of people madly talking to each other. Also, rich people are not my favorite genre of media. However, it is an important part to fully understand the highest level of society. So I understand why it's here. It's like the vegetables of the story, you know? You need them for context. You could live without them, but it's probably better if you have them. That was a weird analogy. Okay. By chapter 21, I also realized that I really like Jakik and Enya. That's where it started to click. Also, remember how I said there were no stakes? Well, the end of this chapter erupts in conflict. The rising action spiked so abruptly, but considering the conflicts of all the arguments, it makes sense that that's how we got here. By the next chapter, not gonna lie, I thought somebody died, and I was about to be real upset. This at least tells me that I have grown attached to some of the characters now at this point. Specifically in part 3, more than I realized. Part 4, the City of Light and Splendor. So now we are back to Elise and Arthur, a duo that I also really appreciate, which I was hoping for more of Jana, but I mean, this works too. And part 4 starts with a bit of action. Chapter 24, in retrospect, is probably my favorite chapter as of reading this when I was writing it, but also now it's probably my favorite chapter because it's like one of those episodes that's this isn't a show. I wish, that'd be amazing. This is one of those chapters where the perspective is from somebody that's just living their life, like a townsfolk, a shopkeeper. And it was so cool to see this person just living their life, and then all of a sudden he sees people that he doesn't recognize and they have banters with each other, and it was just wholesomely hilarious, and we're gonna get into it. Alvin Tullian is introduced here. I don't think he's ever mentioned again past this chapter, but he is a business owner. Relatable. However, the story does a very interesting thing that ties in some previously established characters, which was a nice touch. At first, I wasn't sure exactly who it was, but then it was revealed, and oh my gosh, that was pretty funny. The Arthur-Elsie duo is a team up that the longer it goes on, the more I appreciate it. By chapter 25, it was fun to see this duo play as spies by infiltrating a place incognito. Next, we shift the perspective to Maria and Paul, which, by the way, they are so freaking cute together. I love them, especially when a third person joins this duo, and then it just makes it even more adorable. It's so wholesome. It's great. If you could tell by now, part 4 is where we just keep jumping between perspectives, so you never know who we're gonna focus on next. I also love that most of the italicized words are sign language because, again, Maria talks in sign language. Arthur will just straight up throw punches and knock somebody out if need be. Despite Arthur's abrasiveness, we finally get a deeper look at this character. In chapter 29, a situation from the end of part 1 finally gets resolved. But of course, once one conflict is solved, another one gets introduced. Part 5, The Storm. Elsie and Arthur noticed why chapter 5 is titled The Storm. Next, two worlds collide in an epic conclusion. Chapter 34 was also the chapter where I realized that part 5 is my favorite. And then I read chapter 35, and at this point, I read 5 chapters in one day because I was so incredibly hooked to the conclusion of this story. The very last chapter, before the epilogue, is very depressing, but in a very impactful way. It shows the consequences of a character's actions. In the epilogue, this is something I've been waiting for this whole time, and it does not disappoint at all. In fact, this whole book doesn't disappoint. This whole book is so good. Oh my gosh. After this, we get to the glossary. This is a very useful chapter to the book, especially with certain chapters that have a lot of names getting thrown around. There are basically 6 sections: Odalian citizens, Sial citizens, locations, airships, historical events, and currency. Then we get to the acknowledgements section, and this is a first for me. I was honestly surprised to see my name in the acknowledgement segment as a beta reader, despite me barely having the chance to read it due to life just getting crazy and me not having enough time to read it. So thank you to the author for acknowledging me. I honestly was not expecting it whatsoever, but I greatly appreciate it, honestly. Now, every time I've said the word author, what I actually wanted to say was authors, although the author name is A.D. Griffey. In case you don't know, Aria and David wrote this book. I've known Aria for years, and I am so honored that I was part of the beta reading test, the advanced reader copy, and have this opportunity to share this book with all of you. The Heart of Resistance finds a ragtag, dysfunctional found family who attempts to fight a caste-like system in this jam-packed action-adventure underdog steampunk story, and lets you love each member of this family, quirks and all, even when conflict arises between the characters and their environment. I can't wait to read more about the gang in book 2, The Hope of Rebellion. In the meantime, check out book 1. Available now to order as either a Kindle version, paperback, hardcover, or for a limited time, a hand-bound version of the book which has a limited supply. This story is genuinely amazing, epic, and extremely heartfelt with its characters, so I highly recommend it. And I hope that my review has not only gotten you interested in reading this book, but for you to support more indie authors and the works of art they make.